ladies and gentlemen, can I say first of all what a privilege it is to again have the opportunity to address the MacGill Summer School and to share this platform with such distinguished speakers. My understanding of my remit this morning is to talk about hard decisions, as Sean has said, but hard decisions in the context of transforming Ireland. And I hope in the next 15 minutes to, if not exactly set before you a blueprint of what we could do, but to give you some enticing images perhaps of what our country could be and how we might get to that particular point, what hard decisions would have to be made on the way. And I think obviously the best place to start is with, as they say, the known unknowns. And I'm thinking, of course, that there are immediately in the coming months some very hard decisions to be made. But I suspect that they will be at least different and more far-reaching than might now be apparent. We know, of course, it's been well telegraphed that the spending review, which is to be conducted in the autumn, will result in somewhere between 3.6 billion and 4 billion being taken out of the economy. And since the EU summit last week, the government has been at pains to emphasise that that is not going to change. They're still staying on track on this. Now, in my opinion, this will compound the deflationary impact of the 20.6 billion that has been taken out of the economy in 3 budgets since 2008. And it's difficult to see how this will not have a serious debilitating effect on public services, because at this point, these cuts are cutting into muscle. And to compound the problems, demographic change over the next few years means that the demand on public services will expand rather than contract. If you think about it, an additional 280,000 people will reach the age of 65 in the next 5 to 10 years, myself included, by the way, unfortunately. But with the attendant problem that comes with this, of more people living longer, but sometimes with chronic illness conditions, a condition which will push up by about 40% by 2020, according to the VHI. Now, this level of retrenchment is also profoundly mistaken, in my view, in economic terms. Domestic demand has fallen by 25% since 2008. And when car sales are stripped out, retail sales in May last were 5.2% below the same month in 2010, which was the 37th consecutive month that they have fallen. And car sales will no longer be a sort of a counterbalance to that anyway with the end of the scrappage scheme. And these problems of the retail sector are epitomised in the receivership of the Superquin company last week. Superquin is a very long-established player in the retail sector in Ireland with an annual turnover in excess of 400 million and a 7% share of the market. Now, it is true, actually, that exports are performing very well, and there will be a balance of payment surplus this year. But the jobs really are in the domestic sector of the economy. And in an evaluation of the financial crises that have taken place over 800 years last year, 2 Harvard people, Rogoff and Reinhardt, concluded that it's not possible for a country to recover through exports alone. And if that is true, then we are looking at the prospect of unemployment continuing at its existing high level in excess of 14%. Half of those on the live register have already fallen into the category of long-term unemployed and are in danger of being detached altogether from the labour market. And so you can see in this that the price of austerity potentially is a lost generation of Irish people. Now, it would be hard to say that it would be a price worth paying in any circumstances, but as it happens, austerity is not working. In the second quarter of this year, gross national product was down 4.3% on the first quarter. There's no growth in the economy, and without growth to do some of the heavy lifting of adjustment, it's not possible to generate the level of primary surplus necessary to allow for debt repayment. Markets know this very well, which is why Moody's downgraded Irish debt to junk status on the 12th of July. And only those addicted to the oxymoronic notion of expansionary fiscal contraction believe that we'll return to growth anytime soon. It's not working here, it's not working in the United Kingdom, where similar austerity policies are being implemented. Now, some weeks ago, I participated in the Brussels Economic Forum. This is an annual event which is organised by the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. And the keynote address was given by Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, who is the German finance minister, as you know. Now, he made a number of points in his address which I think were quite chilling from our perspective. And two in particular draw to your attention. He said that in his view, the Eurozone didn't have a crisis, but some peripheral countries had a crisis. And the second point he made was that in his view, solidarity meant preventing the contagion effect from these peripheral countries to the European mainstream. So, if that is official thinking, let's not fool ourselves that the decision in the European Council last week was about us. It was about Italy and the possibility that it would be the next country to fall under the hammer. And with 1.9 trillion euros of debt, 3 times as much as Ireland, Greece and Portugal combined, you can see, of course, that it is of a different order of magnitude, which absolutely terrified the European leaders. And contrary to what Dr. Schäuble said, the problem actually, in my view at any rate, is systemic. And last week's effort is positive, but not the complete answer. The solution must eventually involve Europeanisation of the debt, preferably by means of a common Eurobond. And the details of how this might work with appropriate incentives for both the debtor and the creditor countries has been proposed recently by Paul de Grue, who is a professor at the Louvain University in Belgium. Wolfgang Manchu of the Financial Times last week went so far as to say that Italy could only stay in the Eurozone if its interest rates were reduced, and he doubted that anything other than a Eurobond could achieve this result. I cannot myself see how the Euro will survive the crisis without creating institutions for fiscal and economic coordination. But the deeper integration which this implies, and remember this is a feature which is now obvious from the structure of economic and monetary union, where we have monetary union but nothing else. But the deeper integration that this implies is, I think, and here's the problem in many respects, out of line with the political mood music in many European countries just at the moment. Now, I don't think this is totally surprising, because for all the talk of reform, the perceived cause of this crisis, which is the European banking system, remains substantially unaltered. The hedge funds remain unregulated. There's been no reinstatement of the equivalent of the Glass-Steagall Act to separate retail and investment banking. The rating agencies still pronounce on the soundness of the banks in the countries as if they had no part in the crisis, even though a lot of the European bigwigs rail against them. And of course the bonus culture operates as it always did. And you heard yesterday the head of the regulatory authority here say that it's questionable whether you should constrain the level of pay for leaders in the banking sector. So all of this says to me that reform is for the little people, not for anybody else. So my point is that Europe too has some hard decisions to make. And they involve politicians telling their constituents the facts of life about what is necessary to save the euro. This will be hard enough, I think, because even as the heavily indebted countries like our own have indeed been pushed towards insolvency recently, the people in the disaffected countries, the creditor countries, are also growing fairly antagonistic, which has manifested itself in political expression of Euroscepticism and nationalism in some parties in some of the countries, I'm thinking, for example, of the True Finns in Finland. The reality, though, is that there is no way that countries like Ireland can meet the terms of the bailout agreement. More time is needed for fiscal consolidation to give growth a chance to take hold. And while this latest development in Europe is helpful, it's doubtful, in my view, that it will be enough to make our debt sustainable. I've seen some commentators suggest that this debt would need to be reduced in value by about 50% for us as a sovereign country to be able to afford to borrow again on bond markets. However, if the end game does involve some form of Europeanisation of debt, it seems to me that it will also involve completion of economic and monetary union, meaning fiscal union. This is the remorseless logic of which George Osborne recently spoke. It's hardly likely that in such circumstances Ireland would be allowed to pursue an independent tax policy indefinitely. And this is another hard decision, because we would no longer in those circumstances be able to balance our industrial policy on a kind of a one-legged stool of low corporation tax, or at least not indefinitely. It's not a decision about which we're ultimately likely to be allowed all that much choice, even though it would be manifestly unjust to treat the periphery of Europe the same as the core in exactly the same way. Deeper European integration presents perhaps the hardest decision for Ireland. The recent visits of Queen Elizabeth and President Obama were in a way a manifestation of a foreign policy that sees Ireland as a kind of multi-interface peripheral country. We are in Europe, but not necessarily of it. We balance our European, our Eurozone involvement, the important economic and indeed cultural relationships with Britain and the United States. And at the moment we have the same relationship to Europe as a hen has to the full Irish breakfast. We're involved, but shortly we may become like the pig, fully committed. In any event, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that deeper integration will foreclose the long-running debate here in Ireland, the unresolved debate really, about Boston and Berlin. But in doing so, it may open another. And what kind of country will Ireland be in a more deeply integrated Eurozone? It's a sobering thought that 3 times in the last 60 years Ireland has looked into the abyss of economic catastrophe. In the mid-1950s we were rescued by the designs of the first programme for economic expansion and the adoption of a kind of a change from import substitution industrialisation to export-orientated industrialisation. In the mid-1980s we avoided the clutches of the IMF by embracing social partnership, and by 1994 the economy was on the road to recovery. But before this recovery happened, many people began to question whether Ireland was a viable political entity at all. And such thoughts were quickly discarded as the country began the most sustained period of economic expansion in its history. But now we're in difficulty again, and these troubling questions return. They will be less easily discarded, I think, on this occasion. The doubts of an earlier era did cause some deeper reflection for a time. In 1991, the National Economic and Social Council asked a Norwegian academic, Professor Lars Mjøseth, to conduct a comparative study of Ireland and a number of small, open Northern European economies to find out why we were doing so badly and they were doing so well. But by the time his report was published in 1992, the Irish economy had begun to grow again, and so I think it was kind of left on the shelf. Now, I would suggest there is merit in looking again at this question, because Ireland has more in common with the small open economies of Northern Europe in some respects than it has with Greece or Portugal. With exports worth about as much as our GDP, Ireland is an extraordinarily open economy, far more so than Greece or Portugal. In fact, it is much more like Finland and Denmark, both of whom happen to be among the wealthiest countries in the world. What distinguishes these small open economies is that they long ago decided that the external competitive threat that they faced was such that they had to confine domestic quarrels within certain limits. Denmark is an exemplar of this approach. From the mid-1980s, Danes began to realise that they needed to restructure their economy to deal with globalisation and the demands of European integration. Restructuring the public sector was seen as the key to making the private sector more efficient and competitive in export markets. Neoliberalism informed this process but never dominated it. Welfare and labour market reform was tried unsuccessfully by Conservative governments in the 1980s. However, the Social Democratic-led government which took office in 1992 did achieve some progress, reflected in the very much debated and admired, in fact, in many respects, flex-security model, as it is called, of social welfare and labour market integration. Reform was achieved by the work of tripartite commissions set up to consider different aspects of social and economic policy, and this is defined in the academic literature as creating a negotiated economy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think that if you were to ask a selection of people what their hopes and aspirations were for our country at this time, I suspect that they would wish for the crisis to pass in a couple of years and we would get back to the way we were, perhaps with less exuberance. Well, I don't think that's either likely or indeed desirable. The deeper integration of Europe, at least in an economic sense, and the failure of our own old development model precluded. In short, we have to reinvent ourselves. My long-held belief is that we should try to emulate the Nordic countries, not just for their economic success, but for the social sustainability and equality that is integral to their polity. It is a polity rooted in the political economy approach which holds that the economy is embedded in society and not the other way around. In a political sense, they are social democratic countries which, even when governed by liberals and conservatives, largely adhere to the social democratic polity. Social democracy has never taken root in Ireland. 20 years ago, the SRI explained this in the context of our history, in which every issue since the foundation of the state was conceptualised in terms of independence. Even membership of the EC at the time was sold as a means of enhancing our independence, notwithstanding the loss of sovereignty inherent in that decision. This militated against the emergence of a class-based politics similar to other European countries. It explains perhaps why the Labour Party, which will be 100 years old next year, has never managed to lead a government in this country. When you think about it, our fleeting period of economic success was suboptimal in the type of society that accompanied it. While we achieved virtual full employment, we remained a very unequal society. Its passing is not to be irrationally lamented. Better to look beyond this dark period and start imagining the future in its more promising terms. And as I said at the outset, the future does require some hard decisions for both Europe and ourselves, and they are not the decisions that might be immediately apparent to everybody. Thanks very much indeed.